we're excited that you're here and appreciate your taking the time to come. And we are going to, like I said, do lesson 2, which is ruler's law and anarchy and people's law. So you maybe not have been introduced to that before. When we finish today, you'll know all about those different forms of government. So here's a good question to be thinking. What is the greatest danger to the Constitution and government by the people? You know that we have government by the people. And you learned from last week's lesson that ruler's law is very different than people's law. And so we realize that the Constitution is somewhat in danger, that government by the people isn't permanent unless the people promote it. So that's partly what we're trying to help you be educated on, is how to preserve our Constitution. If you look at the very back of your workbook, you'll see a quote from President General George Washington, and he gave us some really good advice. Amber, do you want to read what that? Liberties need guardians. And that's what a lot of people don't realize. We just are going along thinking everything's great in our government, but actually things are beginning to deteriorate. So we're going to show you how that's happening as we go through. And this has kind of become the motto of Constitution in the classroom, when Washington said that you, the future guardians, need to be educated in the science of government. So lesson 2 is the science of government. And the greatest danger is lack of education. So this is why we go around to classes all over the state of Arizona, and we're trying to promote it in other states as well. We need to help young people know the science of government so that they grow up and are ready to be guardians, are ready to promote government by the people. So there's his quote. And so to understand the science of government, we use this spectrum. You know, when you're measuring something, you can measure power to govern. So what we're going to be talking about today is the power to govern. Who holds power in government? And how is that power controlled? And so if we look at this spectrum, it's like a ruler measuring with 0 on one hand and 100% or another higher number on the other end. And so what we're measuring is the amount of law and control of either tyranny or anarchy. So have you learned the word anarchy before? Anarchy means? Now you have a blank. Yeah. Anarchy means zero government. That means there's just chaos, really, is what happens, is that you have chaos because there's no one ruling. And sometimes that happens when one government falls and another government's trying to take over. For a while there will be no law. And that's what's on this end. And so when we talk about the right, we're not talking about conservatives or a party. A lot of times people say, oh, the Republicans are too far right. Well, that doesn't make sense on a real spectrum, because you've got to either have 0 or a high number on the other end. So down here on the other end is tyranny. Now, that might be easier to remember. What does tyranny mean?
100% government?
Yes, it says it right there, doesn't it? So that's like the ruler's law that we showed you last lesson. Ruler's law is when they make every law, they punish, they do everything. Everything is under a king or a dictator. So that's what tyranny is. So on this spectrum, this is another graph showing it, where you have no one ruling, or you have a ruler who holds all the power. And we like to demonstrate it with the block, because if one person is holding it, then they have all the power to govern, like a tyranny or a tyrant. Okay? So when you have one person who's ruling, ruler's law can be called a king or a czar, pharaoh, sultan, dictator, communism. All of those are different forms of ruler's law, where one person or group of people hold all the power to govern. And so that's what happened all the way down through history. all the countries had one form or another, just different names, but the same kind of government. So these powerful rulers, how do they keep a hold of this? How do they maintain their power over people? What do you think?
They make them think that they're doing the right thing for
They
their,
would, right?
For their,
They think, and they try to convince everyone that everything they do is right. Okay, what else might there be? We'll give you some hints here. If anyone goes against them, what do?
imprisonment.
Right, they just throw them in prison. So we're going to learn later, when we learn about the court system under the Constitution, the judicial branch, they were set up to establish justice. But under ruler's law, the courts are often used just to maintain power and to control people and to unjustly and throw people in prison. So that's one way that they maintain their power is just keeping anyone who is against them controlled, okay? So they don't allow any freedom, and the people actually are subjects. You know, when you see pictures of kings, everyone comes in and bows, and they all basically belong to the king. They are his property. The realm, his country, all belongs to him, the land and the people and everything in it. So they don't allow freedom, because if they do, then what would people do? So everything is held and controlled by the king. And if we look at a demonstration of that, this represents like a country where there's the individuals, and then there's families, community, state, going up the different levels of government. And when you put all of this power on the top, you see how unstable it is? So this is what the founders understood, and they wanted to have a different kind of government. So we'll see how they worked really hard. They had their whole focus on coming up with rule by the people, or people's law, okay? All right, now we want to talk about anarchy. So if we had a ruler, and sometimes we act this out in a classroom when we have more students here, and we'll have someone come up and pretend to be the ruler of the class and have them make up some kind of silly rule and decree what everyone has to wear, what color. So then the students who don't like that ruling, then I'll pick 5 of them to come up and be revolutionaries. So when you have someone who's holding all the power to govern, then you surround them with revolutionaries, and they take the power. And then you have anarchy, because the king has lost his power and exiled or something. So then there's all these other people who would like to hold the power to govern. So then you have, for a time, no one ruling, and the king and his laws are gone. So that's where you end up with anarchy. So in that situation, there's no law and no law enforcement, okay? Right, so what has happened down through history? And I brought my timeline again for you to look at this again and see where the technology leap happened and all the influence of the Declaration, Constitution, and Founding Fathers. So when we looked at the timeline going all the way down through history, we had one ruler after another. And so there would be ruler's law, and then people would be dissatisfied with the ruler and be tired of the frivolous laws that he might create. So then revolutionaries rise up, and then you end up with anarchy, or a state, you know, if they depose the ruler. And then it depends on possibly a general who would have power over the army, who would then take over and become the next ruler, or someone who was very wealthy, or someone who would claim that they were a descendant of the king and had divine right. So then you would end up back at ruler's law. And so this is what continually happened over and over and over again. If you study history, that's what the pattern that you see. And then the most amazing, wonderful thing happened is that this was broken. And it was through the Founding Fathers, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. So that's why when we make note of this on our timeline, we put all three. Because it wasn't just the Constitution, it was the Declaration and the Founding Fathers. So we'll show you how they all contributed to this. All right, so breaking out of the cycle, we had the Declaration of Independence, which established the proper role of government. So lesson 3, we discuss everything about the Declaration that contributed to life being so different here because of that. And then we have the Constitution that was written to control the government so it could not become like a ruler. And then we have great statesmen who didn't seek power. We talked about what a great statesman is, someone who isn't running for office just to get wealthy or to have power. So our founding fathers were mostly interested in setting up some kind of people's law, self-government. That's what they wanted. And it was amazing that there were so many of them with this same vision, because they worked together, and without them we couldn't have had. But here's a great story. Just one little example of how the Founding Fathers had such an influence. And it's called the Newburgh Conspiracy. Have you heard of that before? Have you heard about it? Good. So what do you remember?
Not much.
Just the name?
Was it before
Okay.
the Constitution?
It's what?
Was it before the Constitution?
It was. The Articles of Confederation, and so they had a Congress that was trying to run the country during the Revolution and after. They were trying to come up with a form of government. It just wasn't very efficient yet. It was like they had to make a trial and some errors, and then they eventually came up with the Constitution. But after the war, what happened is that the officers, all of these who had served under General Washington, became really angry and disgruntled because Congress didn't pay them for their service in the Revolutionary War. And so they had begun to meet secretly and conspire. You know what conspire means, right? They're plotting how they can take over Congress and have George Washington become king. So you see, the revolution could have ended the same as every other country, with establishing ruler's law to continue the same as the cycle had shown. But because it was George Washington and he had such great integrity, he refused. He told them he would not, but they continued to meet in secret, and they wanted to try and force him. And they actually were making plans to storm the Congress. And he said, don't start the shedding of more blood. He said, this is not what we fought the war. So what happened in Newburgh, that's why it's called the Newburgh Conspiracy, he showed up at one of their meetings. And while he was there, of course, they let him speak, and he went up and gave the most powerful speech about how they had fought together through the war, and how the founders, the other delegates in the Congress, they had a different vision of the kind of government they wanted to have. They didn't want to have another king. They wanted the power to stay with the people. And so this is what Washington was envisioning. He could see that people could rule. So you divide up the power between the people, and then look how stable it is. Isn't that different than ruler's law? This is what the founders had in mind. They wanted to experiment with people's law. And so he explained that. He said, we didn't fight the war to make me king. And he went through that. And then when he gets towards the end of his talk, he's wanting to read a letter to them. And so he pulls that out of his pocket and he tries to read it, And he can't read it, and so he said, the famous words that he said were, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have grown gray in your service and now find that I am nearly blind." And when the officers saw him do that and heard those tender words, and they no longer wanted to force him to be the king. They remembered how great he'd been with them in the battlefield and during those horrible winters where they were so deprived of things they needed. And he was the first winning general who gave all the power back to the people and said, "No, I'm just going to be a normal citizen now." Isn't that amazing? Just this one little incident shows us that these founders had a different vision of what government should be. And it's because of them. We would not have had our Constitution if we hadn't had those founding fathers. Our country would have just gone through the same cycle like every other country had. And it's interesting to note, in the Library of Congress, that's where they keep record of everything that has gone on, the facts of our country from the beginning. There are 67 occasions that General Washington requested a day of fasting and prayer for help during the war. He was a very spiritual man, and the soldiers all knew that he would every day be found somewhere in prayer. And so we learn that he had integrity, and he was named Father of the Country, right? You've heard that before? And it was for the amazing things he did. He really deserved the title of Father of the Nation. So he was the first president, a man of integrity and honor, and he firmly believed that people could govern themselves. This is what he envisioned, even though there were no other examples anywhere in the world of people ruling themselves or a constitution. He had that vision in his mind. And he was not alone. There were over 200 great founding fathers. And so Mr. Farnsworth is now going to tell you about some of the others and how the founders came up with the ideas that became the Constitution.